Welcome to episode 50 of the Hunt Backcountry podcast, as always presented to you by Exo Mountain Gear. So first off, if you guys have been following live as these episodes are released, I apologize for the delay. As you might know, it's September, the most wonderful time of the year, and Steve and I have been busy hunting. Speaking of it, I'm back from Colorado, where I had a successful elk hunt. Super stoked about that. We will be talking about that in a future episode. Steve, he's out hunting right now as we speak. Today I want to release an episode that we actually recorded a few weeks ago. It is with Whit Fosberg, who is the CEO and president of Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, or as you might have heard of them, TRCP. So let me tell you a story. I was coming down, packing out my bull in Colorado. You know how much work that is. So we get to the trailhead and we're kind of hanging out. We had to hike back up another 2,500 feet and still load out camp. But we're sitting near a trailhead and there's people passing by. And of course they're checking out our bull and chatting us up and checking out the pack goats we happen to be using. And I'm noticing there's all kinds of different people. Sure, there's hunters, but there's fly fishermen there. There's couples out walking with their dog. There is some people out trail running. All of these people, whether they knew it or not, they played a role in a way in enabling me to kill this bull. Because it's all of these people, all of these outdoor recreation folks that enable us to help strengthen our voice as outdoorsmen, as conservationists, and as fans of wildlands. And that's a bit about what we talk about tonight with Whit and about what the TRCP does. That CP, that conservation partnership, is important, and you're going to hear why. So this episode's certainly about hunting, yes. Certainly about conservation, yes. Certainly about animals and habitat, yes. But I hope you get a bigger picture and see just how important it is. Not only the work that TRCP is doing for us as hunters, but how important it is that we play our part as outdoorsmen, as hunters, as conservationists, and work together with those that we might not agree with everything on, but that we do have a common interest with and benefit from. So, enough of that rambling. Want to thank you guys, as always, for the reviews and the feedback. We always ask if you can leave a review on iTunes. We appreciate it. If you have any other questions or comments, go ahead and email us to podcast@exomountaingear.com. And since it's hunting season, we have one more ask. If you have any field photos to share, we would love to see that. We would love to hear about your season. Go ahead and email us at photos@exomountaingear.com. All right, on to this week's show with Whit Fosberg of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Well, Whit, welcome to the Hunt Backcountry podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. Excited to be on with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time, for sure. Are you in Washington now?
I am, right in my office in downtown Washington, D.C.
Awesome. Very cool. So before we get into kind of a background and introduction of yourself as well as the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, I wanted to start off with a rapid-fire question. There's so much negativity in the news in general. There's so much, just bad news out there. Even when we talk about conservation, sometimes I think it's approached from an angle of, clearly how important it is, but how critical it is and how, this sort of scarcity mindset. So I would love to hear something from your perspective. What is one thing that's really encouraging or one thing good that's happening in conservation right now?
Oh, listen, there are tons of good things that are happening in conservation. North America, the United States in particular, is the model of the rest of the world. I think you make a good point that, we tend to focus on the negative and what's not going right, from, some species that's doing badly to climate change to you name it. But, look around. Wild turkeys, black bear, white-tailed deer, elk. These are species that we had almost knocked to the brink of extinction once upon a time, and now they're all over the place, doing great. And there is this is the good old days for a lot of us.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think perspective is helpful, and sometimes it's just good to kind of be reminded of what's positive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Bison. I mean, geez, they were practically extinct.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's really truly unbelievable to look at the stats and specifically the species you mentioned, things like black bear, wild turkey, elk, and how it's recovered and bounded for sure.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, you think back at the turn of the century, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was rare to see a white-tailed deer. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
And now, as you know, they're practically a nuisance species in a lot of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I clearly hunt the West. That's primarily the market for this podcast, but living in the Midwest, we deal with that. We have towns and municipalities that bring in sniper teams to thin the herd. They don't want hunters there because it's a semi-urban, suburban environment. But yeah, to control the population, as you mentioned, it's almost a nuisance in some areas.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So introduce us to yourself as well as the organization, the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and give us some background for the listeners who are not familiar with the work that this organization does.
Sure. Well, as you know, my name is Whit Fosberg. I'm the president and CEO of the partnership. And, my sort of background is, I grew up in upstate New York, hunting and fishing, and my dad worked for the conservation department. And we lived way back on a dirt road with no neighbors. So my brother and I, spent literally all of our formative years just playing outside, fishing a trout stream that ran through our property. We got old enough hunting grouse and then deer. And we also had a little camp in the Adirondacks, and we spent a lot of time up there too. And that's a little bit more sort of real backcountry habitat, more like you're probably used to in the West. So I, ended up going to college in Washington and ended up being a government major down here, and then still felt I knew more about, wildlife and forests than I did about geopolitics, and ended up getting a job, writing and lobbying at that time with National Audubon Society. Went back and got a master's degree in conservation, and then, got jobs, in the U.S. Senate. I was there for 5 years, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, running their fisheries program, Trout Unlimited for almost 15 years, and at the partnership, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, starting in 2010. A lot of your listeners probably have not even heard of the partnership. It was created in 2002 by a guy named Jim Range. And Jim had been, a long time sort of political junkie, inside the Beltway guy, had been chief counsel for Howard Baker when Senator Baker was the majority leader of the U.S. Senate. And Jim had written big chunks of a lot of the major environmental laws in the country, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, things like that. And it had really, come to bother him how fragmented and unengaged the hunting and fishing community was in federal policy. And you really think back to Theodore Roosevelt's time, it was the sportsmen, the hunters, the anglers who created the modern conservation system. I mean, Roosevelt was sort of the epitome of the hunter conservationist. And it was really, sort of first stopping the market hunting to setting aside the public lands. And Roosevelt, during his period, set aside about 240 million acres to be there for the people to hunt and fish forever. And he saw it not just as something that was good for fish and wildlife, but also was good for people, because he credited the wildlands in Maine and the Adirondacks in North Dakota with really making him the man that he became. That's tough, rugged individualism, sort of, epitomized by, sort of difficult backcountry, hunting and fishing. And so he wanted to make sure that everybody else had the same opportunities that he had and really, the chance to form themselves as people. And so, he again started really what we consider now the modern conservation movement. And then you had groups like, at that time, Boone and Crockett Club, Isaac Walton League, National Wildlife Federation, the Wildlife Society, Wildlife Management Institute, all created, largely made up of hunters and anglers to, sort of form the modern, conservation system we have today. And if you notice, all of those groups aren't engaged with any one species or any one location. They were broad national conservation groups. And it was really beginning in the 1930s when Ducks Unlimited was created, and then Trout Unlimited in the 1950s, and then Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, groups like that. And we really had sort of the rise of the species groups. And those groups did amazing work in bringing back species that have really been, pushed to the edge by, hunting, development, a lot of the, threats we see today. But, and over time, as those species groups really grew up and they really had success in restoring habitats and bringing those species back, collectively, the eye of the country was sort of lost on federal policy, which had really created the mechanisms by which, all those species groups could do their work. So Jim Range really wanted to create an organization that brought all the groups together to speak on a common voice on the issues that were too big for any one group. Things like public lands policy, marine fisheries policy, agriculture policy, energy policy, conservation funding. So he did that in 2002, and then I took over in 2010. Jim Range passed away suddenly in 2009 from kidney cancer. So we had to sort of, professionalize the organization and sort of move it past his original vision into a sustainable organization. And we've been doing that since 2010. Today we have 50 different partner organizations, that range from a lot of groups your readers or listeners know well, walking on, from like the Mule Deer Foundation to Trout Unlimited to Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, but also some non-traditional partners like the AFL-CIO was brought in because 70% of their 12 million members hunt and fish. We added the Outdoor Industry Association as a member, and that's the trade association that represents Cabela's, Bass Pro, REI, Eastern Mountain Sports, companies like that, because we really wanted to bring in the economic case for conservation. We brought in the land trust community, Nature Conservancy, Conservation Fund, Trust for Public Lands. So it's very much the big tent, and we really try to focus on, just very core federal policy issues directly related to, basically conservation, habitat, and access.
Yeah, that's awesome. The vision of the TRCP, as reading it from the website, says we guarantee all Americans quality places to hunt and fish by uniting and amplifying our partners' voices to strengthen federal policy and funding. So clearly those partners you mentioned, many of the organizations that our listeners are familiar with and hopefully support, as you mentioned, and then many others. One thing I love is just that idea within the vision of partnership of not only, elk hunters versus, upland game bird hunters and then the trout guys. It's that, yes, it's all sportsmen, but as you mentioned, it's even bringing in some other folks under the umbrella, some of maybe even non-hunting or partners that aren't explicitly in support of hunting. And as you mentioned, leveraging that for the common good of sportsmen.
Yeah, that's a good point. We tend to, too often focus on things we don't agree on. So if, look at inside even the hunting community, it's the gun guys versus the archery guys, or within the archery community, it's the compound bows versus traditional bows versus crossbows. We have lots of things that divide us. But at the end of the day, we all want the same things, which is the opportunity to get out in the field and enjoy, the sport that we love so much. And the only way you do that is with, a lot of habitat out there, with a lot of game on that habitat, and access to those habitats.
Yeah.
So we keep it top line and really focus on what unites us, not what divides us. That's when we have success.
Yeah, absolutely. It strengthened numbers and Washington strengthened dollars in a lot of ways, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's not good enough to say this is something that's good for, sage grouse or ruffed grouse or, mule deer. We also have to make the economic case.
Yeah.
That this is, really a key part of the whole outdoor recreation economy, which is valued at about $640 billion every year.
Yeah, and speak to that a little bit. We hear that number like 640 billion, but like compare that to other major sectors of industry and to help us get a real, picture for how big outdoor recreation truly is from an economic standpoint.
It is only, behind two other sectors, and that is healthcare and financial services. It is bigger than automotive. It is bigger than pharmaceuticals. It is bigger than real estate. People don't understand what a big deal the outdoor recreation economy is because were so diffuse.
Right.
I mean, it's some guy in their RV traveling to Yellowstone for the vacation. It's you and me going backcountry hunting. It's somebody else, hiking the Appalachian Trail. I mean, you add all that stuff up, that's how you get that huge number of $640 billion. But because we're so dispersed, diffuse, rarely does that we have the muscle that other industries that are far smaller than ours seem to have.
Yeah.
Now, for the first time next year, Department of Commerce is going to start reporting on outdoor recreation figures, which will be a very significant step to sort of legitimizing our community and giving it the same clout as other sectors of the economy have, oil and gas or whatever it might be. And I think then we start to get the respect that we deserve.
Yeah.
But right now, it's very easy for people sort of to marginalize our community as, oh, gee, that's what that's fun. That's what you do on the weekends. That's not serious economics. Well, it is serious economics. And it's also, an economy that grew at 5% during the Great Recession every year. So it's close to home. It's something that everybody can enjoy. It's jobs that aren't going to get shipped to China. This is stuff that's here and it's always going to be here if we don't, sort of destroy the golden goose, which is our public lands, which is our local parks, which is our ability to get outside.
Yeah, for sure. So that whole idea of uniting, at this high level, when you speak of these giant organizations and maybe bringing an REI into a legislative piece, for example, that also benefits hunters, we need to, I think, roll that down at a personal level and begin to look as individual hunters and realize how we can coexist with non-hunters who also enjoy, benefit from, and want to help protect, wild places that we also benefit from and find that common good. What are some of the challenges or any sort of advice that you would have on that personal level of hunters, interacting with, finding common ground with, and even, co-supporting non-hunting outdoor recreation folks?
Well, I think the first thing is, be respectful. I mean, it doesn't, I would say this on both sides. I mean, even if you're not a hunter, you ought to respect, what the hunting community has done since Roosevelt's time to, sort of provide this legacy, which we all enjoy today, of abundant wildlife, abundant fish, beautiful public lands, open access for everybody. And so, but on our side, if somebody doesn't hunt, they want to just hike, they want to, hang glide, whatever it is, that's great. I mean, there are places for all of us out there. Backcountry hunters often have a pretty negative view of motorized, vehicle users and ATVs and, all that. Well, listen, I mean, ATVs have their place. I mean, they're great. They stay where they're supposed to stay. They don't do damage, play by the rules. I mean, listen, let's not get into fights with those guys because we need them on, big issues like, well-managed public lands in general. So I think that just sort of being respectful from both sides is the first key. And then also just keep your eye on the prize. I mean, we can have disputes about, a particular plan on BLM lands or on Forest Service lands and, what areas are going to be motorized, what areas are going to be backcountry. That is a luxury to be able to have that debate. What we don't want to do is all of a sudden get so caught up in having that debate that we all of a sudden look up and Congress has sold off those public lands.
Yeah.
So let's keep an eye on the prize.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a big thing that's current for sure, as you mentioned, is this talk of sell-off of public lands, which in many ways, as I've heard rumblings of it over the years, to me, being uninformed, maybe being ignorant a few years ago, didn't sound feasible. But there's been unfortunate progress that hints towards some of that truly becoming a reality in some cases. Can you kind of talk about the current state of affairs with that?
Yeah, no, it's easy to sort of marginalize this stuff as these are just a bunch of kooks, and every 10 or 15 years we hear the same sort of thing, and it's easy not to take it very seriously, and it's easy to look at a picture of the Bundys taking over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge and just say, what a bunch of clowns. And this is never going to be something that gains traction. But I think what we're seeing today is a little bit different than we've seen in the past. In the early, sort of 1970s and 80s, we had the Sagebrush Rebellion. We had, later on, the shovel brigade in Nevada, which, organized to reopen a road that had been closed on a Forest Service, lands. And, so periodically we have this stuff. And, they get pushed back and, we go on and nothing much happens. What I think we're seeing today is different because, for two things. One, I think there has been a sustained pattern since, the 80s when we talked about, sort of starving government, shrinking the size of government. And, the first way to sort of do that is to starve it of the funds. Now, the whole notion of starving the beast has not worked particularly well for a lot of, things like Medicare or Social Security or the other sort of big entitlements or defense spending. It's worked pretty darn well in terms of our public lands and conservation. In the 1970s, conservation was about 2.5% of the overall federal budget. Not a lot of money. If you think about all of our parks and, environmental protection work and, the stuff that we sort of take for granted today. Today, it's about 1% of the federal government, the federal budget. And so it is really, sort of as a percentage of the overall federal budget been shrinking and shrinking. And we see that in a lot of the way our public lands are managed. We see, over 2,000, recreation facilities on Forest Service lands have been shut down because, Forest Service can't afford to keep them open. We have that same agency, the Forest Service, used to spend about 15% of its budget fighting wildfire. Today, that's more than half of its annual budget is just fighting wildfire, which leaves the agency very little, if any, money to do any proactive management, such as reducing the risk of wildfire or managing wildlife habitat or, getting rid of invasive species. We see it's the 100th anniversary of the National Park System, and we hear reports about a $12 billion maintenance backlog on the park system alone. And, so you can look across, and this is starting to have some real implications. And as you basically been starving the agencies of the money they need to really do their job, what do we have? We have, sort of this growing discontent out in the public land states. That, this sort of mantra that the federal agencies just can't manage this land properly, and let's do something different. Let's sell it off, let's give it to the states, and we're sure they'll do a better job. So we've been seeing that sort of steady erosion. At the same time, you have sort of entities on the, sort of the far right side, something called the American Legislative Exchange Council, that is producing these model legislation for all the Western states, demanding that the federal government return those federal lands to the states. We have, something called the American Lands Council, which is a nonprofit that was created to do nothing but lobby the federal government to get rid of the public lands. And, it's funded by, a lot of sort of, quote, dark money, sort of very right-wing political causes that, frankly, want to get rid of the public lands so you can get more resource extraction happening on our public lands. So you have this sort of combination of growing dissatisfaction with the way the federal government manages, public lands due to the continued shrinking budgets on public lands, and then a lot of money going into these efforts to promote and make legitimate this whole notion of getting rid of our federal lands. Now we're starting to see that manifested in Congress. 2 years ago, we had a non-binding resolution that passed the Senate, 51-47, saying it ought to be, the policy of the U.S. to get rid of all lands that are not national parks and national monuments. We had, another bill that actually passed out of the House Resources Committee this year, saying that the states could purchase up to $2 million of forest lands or national forest lands in the, from the federal government. And, so we're starting to see a lot of these things that were once considered very fringe, very loopy, now considered mainstream. And it argues, so I think we're seeing this, but I think a lot of your listeners will rightly say, well, see, what's the big deal if it gets transferred to the states? We deal with the state agencies all the time. They manage our game populations. They overall do a pretty darn good job at this. What would be wrong with more of a local solution to management issues?
Yeah, government is government, right? Unfortunately. Not right. Some people might think government is government, right? It's, it's lands managed by the state or the, the feds, but it's just government management.
That's exactly right. And, why not have that government management look closer to home where, people understand the real issues better than Washington, D.C. does.
Right.
And that is some rhetoric that has a lot of appeal to, I think, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But here's what the facts are. The federal lands are managed by law for multiple use. So Forest Service lands, BLM lands, refuge lands, you can have a whole sort of different uses. You're going to have some mining, you're going to have some logging, you're going to have cattle grazing, but you also have to maintain good populations of fish and wildlife. You have to maintain public access. It's true multiple use. Refuge system managed a little bit more on the side of wildlife. BLM historically has managed a little bit more on the side of grazing and mining, but in general, they're all still multiple use. The state agencies have a very different mandate than the western states. Eastern states a little bit different deal, but there's a lot less public land in the east. Western states, a lot of those states, the majority of them, have a constitutional mandate to maximize profit on their lands. So that means that fish and wildlife are going to be at the back, in terms of what direct receipts that go to the state, to things like mining, logging, grazing, that produce revenues every single year to the state. I mean, look at the way the states manage our lands today. You have states, in a lot of the western states, you can't camp, you can't use motorized vehicles, you can't have campfires. Public hunting is prohibited on about 80% of Colorado state lands. And then also there's another issue that people don't think about, which is what happens when the cost of, say, a catastrophic wildfire comes through. Okay? I mean, the federal government picks up that tab right now. Do we really expect the states are going to raise taxes to pay for that? Or are they going to sort of get rid of those lands, sell them off, lease them to try to pay for that?
Yeah.
Now, there's another thing here that people aren't recognizing too. The federal government, according to the Constitution, can run a deficit. And you could argue that, how much of a deficit may be too much. But we don't have to basically balance the budget every single year. States, on the other hand, have to balance that budget every year. So if we have a situation where all of a sudden, let's say, oil and gas prices, drop to $40 a barrel or less, what's the state going to do? Again, is it going to raise taxes, or is it going to sell off some of those lands in order to balance the budget? Mm-hmm. And your listeners ought to Google something called Elliott State Forest in Oregon if they want a real-world example that's going on right now of our public lands that are being sold off to profit the state. And that's about 80-plus thousand acres in Oregon that's being sold off that will never be open to public access ever again for hunting, fishing, hiking, bird watching, you name it. So this is not a theoretical, issue. And in fact, all the western states, when they got statehood, were given a big chunk of lands they could do with what they wanted. They can maximize revenue off them by grazing or mining or anything like that, or they could sell them off. And about a third of all those lands that were given to the states in the first place have been sold off to date. So this is not theoretical. This has and still is happening today.
Yeah. So do you think there's a greater threat for a big movement of the federal government offloading large sections of land at a time, or do you think there's also a slow drip effect where it's like just consistently they're giving states more and more rights to take over federal lands?
I think that, first of all, Congress is the only one that, can allow the federal lands to be sold off to the states or transferred to the states. So, this is going to have to happen by act of Congress. It's not something that can just happen because a state wants it to happen.
Right.
So, I'm not nearly as worried about the drip of, delegating authority. Listen, the states and the feds manage these lands, cooperatively anyway. Mm-hmm. The states have primary, management responsibility for fish and wildlife on federal lands, as long as it's not an endangered species. So that sort of, co-management scares me a whole lot less than Congress starting to sell these off. Maybe it will be that we had a test case this year where they tried to sell off the Vieques National, Refuge, or what National Wildlife Refuge in Puerto Rico as part of the Puerto Rican, debt bill. And we, pushed back hard, and sportsmen around the country pushed back hard, and that was pulled out of the deal. But all it takes is a few of those things happening, a few bills here and there, for all of a sudden, Congress to say, well, listen, it happened in Puerto Rico, or it happened here. Why not have it happen here? This is just one little forest. It's one refuge, not a big deal. And, once we allow that to happen, then it's going to be Katie bar the door, because every state's going to want these lands in order to sell them off in order to make a lot of money.
Yeah. Hearing this and then, just the idea that this is going to be potentially happening in Congress, we do have, as individuals, as hunters, a voice there. And, there's so much cynicism, against Washington, not just in terms of conservation, just obviously in general. And personally, I fight that. Talk to us a bit about what we can do when issues like this arise, how we can stay informed, and, does our call matter? Does our letter matter? Like, really, what can we do, and how does it make a difference on the ground in Washington where you're at?
Yeah, no, I think you raised a really good point. It's very easy to be cynical and to not engage and just say, sort of hell with all of them. And let me tell you, these guys still care about being reelected. They still care about votes. They still care about, wanting the sportsmen in particular to be behind them, because the sporting community is viewed as a very middle of the road, maybe a little bit right-leaning community that matters. It's not like the Greenpeace and the Sierra Club telling them something. They want to hear what our community has to say. And I think you've seen, I use that example of the Vieques National Wildlife Refuge in Puerto Rico. That got pulled out of there. That sell-off got pulled out because sportsmen spoke up loud and clear that it was unacceptable. And, I think we need to keep doing that. And listen, it may be, you can do something that's very easy, like, go onto our website. We have something called, we created a website called sportsmansaccess.org. It has a petition just saying you're against selling off the public lands. Sign that petition. Letters will be sent to your local and federal representatives, expressing your interest. Or you can do something that takes a little bit more energy, which is actually contact your congressman or your senator's office directly, or your governor or your county commission, and say, public lands are important. I recreate on them. They're important for my business if you happen to be a guide or an outfitter. And it's really an American birthright, and do not dare, get rid of these things. Instead, let's invest in them and really have them achieve the economic potential that they could. And I think that, that makes a huge difference. And, however you want to engage, it could be just a simple sign a petition, or contact your congressman, or write a letter to the editor, or, make a trip to D.C. and, be heard there. But I think, Mark, what we're seeing right now is we're starting to see the tide turn a little bit. And we're starting to see county commissions throughout the West actually pass resolutions saying, we want our public lands. Now, that would not be happening if they were not hearing from people who are complaining about this. Teton County in Idaho most recently passed a resolution saying it wanted these public lands. You have politicians like Steve Bullock, the governor of Montana, who senses correctly that public lands enjoy broad support throughout that state, and he is running for re-election largely on a public lands and public access platform, which is great. That means he is listening to our community, and if our community didn't speak up, he wouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is encouraging. It's cool to hear that that's not like a super buried point in a re-election bid, but actually part of a platform.
Yeah, no, it's great. And look, you have, Trump and Clinton have both come out strongly in favor of the federal government keeping federal lands in federal hands. And, let's hold the feet to the fire on that and make sure that both of those candidates live up to their promises, both throughout the election process and then after one of them gets elected.
Yeah. I just thought of this, is there any sort of, whether it's from the TRCP or any other organization that sort of ranks or rates or at least provides history or context on those running for office and their views, their platform, or their voting history on issues related to public lands? I mean, I'm thinking of like the NRA has like a rating on politicians, right? And I've never investigated that to see how legit it is, but I'm thinking something like that could be helpful to at least provide some base context.
Yeah, there's a little bit of it going on. The League of Conservation Voters has its own scorecard. It doesn't necessarily just deal with public lands, but it deals with a whole bunch of environmental issues. But really, I think that the entity that does the best job on this is Field and Stream.
Okay.
And Field and Stream every year, and they'll be doing it shortly. I've not seen the fall issue yet, but releases essentially a voter guide which talks about, what candidates are saying what on the issues that matter to us. We hosted a media summit earlier this summer out in Colorado and had a presidential forum where Field and Stream moderated it for us and represented the Clinton campaign, Congressman Mike Thompson from California, and represented the Trump campaign, Donald Trump Jr. Both came and spent an hour answering questions from Field and Stream, but also from the assembled journalists in the room. And that will be in the election issue, whichever one that is, that Field and Stream and probably Outdoor Life publish, coming up very soon. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage your readers to get that, look at it, pay attention to it, and then one, vote conservation, but two, also let's put a big thank you out there to Field and Stream and Outdoor Life for actually doing this stuff, because they know that's not what sells magazines. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do for our community and for our future generations getting outside.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. So something else I'd love to get your thoughts on in terms of, us hunters scattered throughout the country and the part that we can play for the future of, land access, conservation, all these big issues. Something I think that we can personally do is just obviously present hunting in a good light, which we touched on in that respect and things of that nature, but is to help educate the non-hunting public, because the fact is we live in a time that's drastically different than the time that my parents and my grandparents grew up in. Meaning, my grandpa was a hunter and he was not a quote unquote hunter. It's just that everybody hunted then, right? Or nearly everyone. And so now hunting is this niche, it's this sort of special thing, when in reality it was just a pastime for majority of folks, right? Either hunted themselves or knew someone directly that did. Now we have large sections of the population that not only don't hunt, they don't even necessarily know hunters directly, and what they see or know about hunting is, maybe what's in the media or portrayed poorly on Facebook or something like that. So can you kind of speak maybe to the importance of the part that we play in educating non-hunters, and then maybe even if you want to relate that to the work that you do in Washington, helping to educate those there on the benefits of hunting?
Yeah, you raised a really good point, because America has changed, but it's going to continue to change. We've gone for a largely, rural agrarian society to one that is highly urbanized. And, but at the same time, I think that, I'm actually fairly bullish on this one. I think that, hunting, really we've seen with certain crossover folks like, Randy Newberg, Stephen Ranella, people like that, who, they're guys that make hunting interesting even for non-hunters, because they really emphasize, fair chase. They emphasize, public lands. They emphasize the food aspect of it. So, I've got a bunch of friends who don't hunt, but they're really into the sort of wild game, whole aspect, because it's, locally harvested, sustainable, it's non-GMO, it's about as organic as you get. Mm-hmm. And I think that, that really appeals to a lot of folks now who are concerned with where their food comes from. I also think that, it's incumbent upon us to think about how we present, hunting to the general public. For every Cecil the Lion that happens, for every sort of Ted Nugent, tirade, it just turns off the non-hunters so amazingly that, people can say what they want to say, and that's fine, but, we've got to make sure that the face of hunting is something that is, it's local, it's polite, it's inviting, it really emphasizes, habitat for all. If, even if somebody's not a hunter and they just love bird watching or hiking, that's great. But I would say, and we do it here, we even have a staff policy here that if you go out and you take somebody hunting for the first time, it doesn't count as a vacation day. So we encourage our staff to get out there and teach somebody to hunt or to fish, and to, sort of get outside and take somebody else outside that might not have that opportunity otherwise, and really present that face of, hunting and fishing as, not something that's gruesome or cruel, but something that is all American and as healthy as you can get. I think back here, part of the reason we partner with groups like, REI and, the Outdoor Industry Association is to try to expand that. Because, listen, if you're a bird watcher or a hiker, you're facing a lot of the same pressures too, and you need a strong alliance with the hunting and fishing communities, just like you need a strong alliance with the motorized recreation guys and everybody else. We are not going to win this thing in isolation. We have to partner with other groups that have the same long-term goals in mind that we do, which is well-managed public lands, lots of wildlife either to hunt or to watch, and plenty of access to get on those lands.
Yeah, absolutely. So those lands, those special places, those is the vision of TRCP states that the quality places to hunt and fish. Quality is certainly a concern, not just obviously having access, but having good populations to support it and things like that. I think that's where some of the species-specific conservation organizations have clearly done a great job, right, in bolstering the habitat and the population of those species. One interesting thing I saw in browsing the TRCP website under that idea of quality habitat was this idea of backcountry conservation areas being is it a new land management type? Kind of give me the scoop on these backcountry conservation areas.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because I think that's a pretty exciting initiative. And that is specifically something for, Bureau Land Management lands. And as you know, BLM is actually the nation's largest landholder. It's got 250 plus million acres out there. And a lot of it is the sort of more arid, less desirable, historically, lands. Lots of Nevada, Utah, Idaho, states like that. And these are largely lands that we couldn't be given away during the Homestead Act back in the 1800s. And then have been, largely grazed or mined or logged. But, they're incredibly important for fish and wildlife and backcountry habitat. So what we've been trying to do is, to get BLM to recognize there are certain lands they have that may never be designated as wilderness. They may not be pristine in the traditional sense, but they're really undeveloped. They may have a two-track that goes through them someplace, but basically these are large, intact blocks of habitat that are critical, especially, sort of game migration. And so we've been trying to get BLM to recognize that these areas deserve special protection that may not be wilderness, but it's not going to be sort of open season for development either. So we've been working with the agency. They're doing something. They've been revising their planning handbook. So anytime that a BLM unit is, they have a management plan, and periodically those management plans need to be reopened for public input. And right now, all the guidance on those management plans is based on a law that passed back in the 1970s. They've never updated that. And they're in the process of updating it right now. So what we're trying to do, and I think we're having a lot of success with that, is to get every time BLM opens one of these plans, they have to look at these backcountry conservation areas and these large blocks of intact habitat and really decide, does that deserve to be protected and managed, basically to leave it the way it is today. If there's a little bit of grazing on there, no problem. If they want to sort of do directional drilling for oil and gas under the, that land, not a problem. If there is an old two-track that goes through, you don't need to shut it off. But, in general, these areas need to be maintained for, backcountry conservation and for fish and wildlife. And we're getting a lot of traction, with the agency on this, and also a lot of traction locally, with hunting, especially the hunting community, but also with the ranching community and the other folks, which see this as the kind of leave it the way it is today, let's not trash it alternative. And if folks want to learn more about that, we've set up a separate website called sportsmanscountry.org, and they can see about what we mean by this and get more details about it, and also they can weigh in on a petition we have there. But I think this is the sort of way a lot of these places need to go, because right now we sort of are forced into dealing with the extremes. Wilderness, which means that nothing will ever happen on that land ever. And wilderness is great, and it's really suitable for some areas. Or, open lands that are open for any sort of development, oil and gas, solar arrays, wind farms, enhanced grazing, whatever it might be. And there's got to be something in between those two, and that's what we're trying to do with backcountry conservation areas.
Yeah. One takeaway that I've had from this conversation is just hearing the word compromise. And so many times it's heard in such a negative light. But it's the compromise in many instances that gets things done. And I think so many of the people who are dissatisfied with Washington, who know how broken the two-party system is and complain about, things not getting done, it's because there's refusal to compromise in many ways. And so we are hypocrites if we, I think, point fingers at Washington in general and in the ineffectiveness of politics, because they fail to compromise when we're not willing to compromise ourselves. And so I think that this is a good instance of that. We're never going to take these areas, as you mentioned, and then turn them back into wilderness. We can't roll back time, right? But this quote unquote compromise of sort of pausing them in time and claiming them for backcountry conservation, I think, is a really good thing.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I also think that, sort of the whole backcountry conservation area concept recognizes something else too, which is that there are times when management actually is important. We want to go in there and we want to do some treatments to enhance wildlife. We want to go in there and get rid of invasive species if they're really threatening an area. And, those are things you can't do in wilderness and that typically aren't done in just a lot of the general lands. So, it's a recognition that areas need to be kind of kept the way they are today, a lot of areas, especially the important fish and wildlife ones, but also that we have the ability to go in and manage them for wildlife to make sure that they're maintained in the quality they are today, or even gotten better.
Yeah, excellent. Are there any other urgent or timely issues that are happening now as we speak, or that you see on the horizon very soon, in terms of from a legislative standpoint?
Well, we talk a lot about access, and access means different things to different people. I mean, just because we have a big tract of federal land out there doesn't necessarily mean it's accessible. And you're in the West, and you hunt a lot in the West, and you've probably seen how the sort of land management or land use has changed. In the old days, you could go to some old-time rancher, and you could knock on his door and get permission to walk across his property to access the national forest. It was never a big deal. And but all of a sudden, a lot of those old ranches now have been, bought by, a hedge fund guy from New York or a Silicon Valley guy from California. And the first thing that happens is no trespassing signs get posted. And so we have been losing access, across the West. And it doesn't mean there are necessarily less public lands. It just means they're a hell of a lot harder to get to than they used to be. And there are a few things that we're trying to do about that. I mean, one is the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a program in Congress. It was created by Congress 50 years ago in a compromise, just like you talked about. It opened up the outer continental shelf to oil and gas development. In return, proceeds from that development would fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which up to $900 million a year would be used annually to protect special places and to provide public access and recreation. And Congress has traditionally not fully funded. In fact, it's only been fully funded once in those 50 years. Instead, the rest of that money just gets siphoned off to go into the general treasury for who knows what. But then also that program, basically the authorization ran out 2 years ago. Now we got a temporary 3-year extension on that last year. But, listen, we need sportsmen all over the place to stand up and say, this program, Land and Water Conservation Fund, is critically important, not just for creating an urban playground or a baseball field or something like that, which it can do, but also for essentially buying, let's say, an access easement across that private land to the national forest. And a lot of the LWCF now is used for programs that actually directly benefit sportsmen's access. And if that program goes away or isn't fully funded, our accesses are going to continue to shrink. So, that's just one thing I would encourage your listeners to engage in and pay attention to. Another one is there was something called the Voluntary Public Access Habitat Improvement Program in the Farm Bill, which collectively is sort of known as open fields. And this was created in the 2008 Farm Bill. And it is a program that actually pays landowners to open up their private lands for public hunting and fishing. And, a lot of the same way where some of those lands may get sold off, to a rich Californian or New York guy and closed to public access, a lot of landowners to keep those lands themselves have closed them down because they are afraid of liability, for example. Somebody steps in a ditch and breaks their leg and they're going to get sued. It's just easier for a landowner to put up a no trespassing sign. So this program, they enter into a deal with the state, and the state actually pays them to keep that land open for public hunting and fishing and public access, and the state assumes all the liability from that. So it was originally authorized as a $50 million program, and in the first Farm Bill, that got added about 3 million acres of land, private lands for public hunting and fishing, and mostly in the western states. But now it's really spread in the most recent Farm Bill to a lot of the eastern states. The big states in the last go-around were Connecticut, Pennsylvania, a lot of the places where, really it's hard to get on to public lands for, hunting and fishing.
Yeah, that's huge.
So
for
I would
public.
just have, it's huge. And I would just have your listeners really pay attention to that program. And as we get into the next Farm Bill, we're going to make a major push at trying to expand that, so that there is it's a way bigger program than it is right now, because for especially those of us back here in the East, it's a big deal to compensate private landowners to open up their lands for public hunting and fishing.
Yeah. So when you talk of expanding that just means essentially designating more funds to then pay those landowners so that the program can be expanded?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, precisely. It's really a matter of money, because there is way more demand on behalf of the states than there is federal money to pay for this. Now, a lot of the states do this themselves. I mean, Montana, Kansas, states like that have these block grant programs where they've been basically using hunting license funds in those states to pay for the same program at the state level. We created this program at the national level to, one, be able to expand it in those states that didn't have or that already had the program, and then B, to encourage states like a Massachusetts or a Connecticut that didn't have those programs to open it up, because here's some federal money to make it worth your while. So, it's all about the money in that particular case.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Whit, this has been excellent conversation. I really appreciate your time. I just want to end with you letting us know how we can stay informed, follow the work of TRCP, and then how we can support the TRCP and the work that you guys are doing for us.
Well, there's a couple of different ways, Mark. And I think first, we'd love it if folks just went to our website, and that's trcp.org. Like us on Facebook, join up as a member if you want to buy a hat or a nice, we're offering a great, blaze orange Sitka vest right now as a premium. If you join up as a supporter, do that. Or if your real issue is, something like just straight public land access, go to sportsmansaccess.org and sign that petition. If you're interested in the Backcountry Conservation Area concept, go to sportsmanscountry.org, sign that petition. So a lot of different ways you can get engaged. And we're a small organization. We've got field staff in most of the western states. I would encourage your folks to get to know them. They can find their contact information on our website and get in touch with them directly and really find out what they can do to sort of help out. Yeah,
that's excellent. Listeners, I will definitely include the links to all of those resources in the show notes. Just go to exomountaingear.com/podcast, look for this episode, and you'll get the links to all those resources. Whit, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Mark, anytime. Happy to be on.
Well, thanks as always for tuning in, guys. We are going to have some awesome episodes coming up. We have hunting stories, hunting trip reports, some great interviews lined up throughout this fall. Now that September is getting closer to a wrap, we aim and hope and strive to publish episodes more regularly for you guys. Again, as always, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, suggestions, anything you want to hear covered, any guests you want to see interviewed, go ahead and shoot us an email to podcast@exomountaingear.com. If you're enjoying the show, your review on iTunes would help us tremendously, and we appreciate it. Until next time, guys, happy hunting.